The security wand screamed over my belt for the third time, while two men in tailored suits drifted through the other lane on a breezy beep. The guard's grin thin as a blade. Lemon cleaner stung the marble air. Sunlight climbed the lobby wall like a measuring stick, and by the time I reached the 12th floor, the receptionist was already asking for one more ID without lifting her eyes. The senior paralegal tapping a lacquered nail against a projector remote. The executor's silver tie pinning a smile that said the agenda would survive me. Me with my worn coat, my blue folder warmed by years of hospital benches and bus rides, my name printed smaller on the sign-in line, like a quiet mistake no one intended to fix. They'd nudged a corner chair back for me, a polite exile with a view of their perfect folders, but when a brown envelope grazed my palm in the hallway and the raised seal inside caught the light like a small moon, I knew the room's smooth script had a missing page, and before this day was over, I would read it aloud. Before I go on, hit subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. If this speaks to you, share it. Awareness protects our elders. The humiliation arrived before the elevator did. At the security desk, the guard's gloved hand hovered over my chest and then over my hips, the handheld wand chirping like a smoke alarm that only I could hear. A metal bowl slid toward me for keys and coins. Two people behind me drifted past another lane without a second glance, the turnstile letting them through on a breezy beep, while my belt buckle got its third scan. I stood still, the cold of the polished floor pressing through my shoes, and watched a streak of pale sunlight climb the lobby wall as if measuring how long a man could wait. The air smelled like lemon cleaner and hot copy toner, a sharp blend that reminded me of long afternoons in offices where my name rarely showed up in bold. When the guard finally waved me on, I gathered my wallet, my pen, and the blue folder I had carried through 100 waiting rooms with my wife. The folder had weight and give, like a steady hand. I pressed it to my ribs and crossed to the elevator bay. Somewhere above, a printer coughed out another stack, and heels tapped code on the marble. On the 12th floor, the reception counter held a cardboard holder with pens chained to it, and a sign-in sheet clipped flat. The line of names was neat, the columns perfect. My name sat there in smaller letters, as if it had shrunk during printing. "One more ID," the receptionist said. Not unkind, not kindly either. Eyes trained on the screen, as if the words had been cued ahead of me. I laid out my driver's license and my veteran card. She studied the photo, then me, then the screen again, as a copier chirped behind her, like a bird that didn't need sunlight to sing. The conference room smelled like new carpet and burnt coffee. A long table ran the length of the glass wall, and identical gray folders lay on every playmat, lined up like rulers. The chairs had been pushed in tight except for one at the far corner, pulled a few inches back as if it had misbehaved. I took it without comment. The executor's briefcase rested near the head of the table, latches shining. The senior paralegal stood by the projector with her arms folded, the kind of posture that says the agenda will not be moved by a human need. I balanced my blue folder on my knee and set my small notebook on the table. The paper smelled faintly of dust and ink. We began with a roll call. The paralegal spoke in a soft, fast rhythm that made the list sound like rain down a gutter. Numbers followed, appraisals, valuations, distributions, dates. Each term slipped into the next, and the screen filled with columns that did not know my history or my nights. My name flickered on a slide in a thin font near the bottom, riding a footnote where a child might not see it. The executor cleared his throat and kept the calculation moving. I traced the edge of my folder with my thumb and felt the ridge where the plastic had cracked and been taped back together years ago. There was a sensation I recognize in rooms like this.
It arrives without sound, like a door adjusting to its frame. People don't change their faces, but chairs slide a little farther, and a smile chooses to stay shut. The projector hummed and the blinds rattled against each other with every gust of the building's breath. The paralegal requested a short pause to verify annexes and pointed to the receptionist through the glass. Papers shuffled. The door opened. Air cooled. I stepped into the corridor to roll my spine and breathe. The hallway held the quiet that comes after carpet installers leave, a chemical hush that makes every footfall loud. My blue folder hung at my side like a pail of water carried a long way. As I turned toward the water fountain, a man in a gray jacket brushed past, close enough that I caught the faint smell of winter wool warmed by a radiator. He slid an envelope into my hand with a motion so practiced that for a second I thought I had picked it up from a table. His face was plain and careful, a face that would not be described to a sketch artist. And then it was gone. He was already walking, then turning, then swallowed by a side door with a soft click. I looked down. The envelope was brown and thick, the kind that keeps its own secrets. On the back, a strip of clear tape had been laid down clean. I broke it along the seam with my fingernail and found a stack. A copy of an addendum registered at the county clerk's office. The stamp is sharp as if the clerk had just lifted it. A page titled Annex B, a short letter of instructions with a reference line and a date, and 2 witness statements paperclipped to a small pack of receipts. The ink smelled fresh. My fingers took on that faint ghost of purple-blue from a brand of toner that never admits it is still wet. On the addendum, a line spoke in the exact grammar of offices, a clause of equalization to be applied upon proof of care rendered in specific years, with 2 attestations and receipts attached. My heart did not jump. It lowered into a steady position, like a leveler finding its bubble. I glanced at the corner, book and page numbers clearly printed. The letter used the same case caption as the conference room agenda. Whoever assembled this had worked close to the file. I slid everything back into the brown envelope and pressed the seam flat with my palm. In the glass wall, my reflection looked older than it had in the elevator. Not a surprise. The blue folder thumped against my leg as I re-entered the room. The paralegal had regrouped her stack. The executor stared at a phone turned face down. The receptionist stood near the door with a clipboard, watching the floor as if something might sprout there. "I need this entered into the minutes," I said, setting the envelope where the light could find it. I gave the book and page numbers, the date, the stamp. My voice sounded like gravel poured carefully. No one raised an eyebrow and no one laughed. The paralegal took the envelope with fingertips that did not want to take it and slid a copy from inside. The smell of fresh ink spread like a candle under glass.
Numbers paused. Columns held their breath. The projector screen showed a cell with a formula waiting for a command. Somewhere down the hall, a phone began to ring in that muted way office phones ring, as if the urgency must be translated first. The senior paralegal said the meeting would pause for a brief internal review. She gathered the envelope, the copy of the addendum, the Annex B, and the letter of instructions, all now imprinted with the day's fingerprints and tiny static sparks. Her smile was flat and civil. My chair stayed a few inches from the table, exactly where I had found it. I kept my blue folder on my lap to keep my hands from asking questions. I could feel the edge of my small notebook through the plastic, the cardboard warm where my palm had been. Through the glass, the lobby of the floor moved with its own weather. Partners drifting by like clouds, assistants gusting in and out with coffee and staplers. I thought of my granddaughter, Maya, still at school for the morning. The way she catalogs and names everything on her phone, how she teases me for labeling even the backs of photographs.
I did not reach for my phone. I watched the envelope travel in the paralegal's hands, like a small boat being nudged into a canal. The receptionist opened a side door, and the crosstalk on the other side was a dry rustle, the pages of a bureaucratic forest turning without wind. The executor said we would resume momentarily. He adjusted his tie with a gesture that made the silk look like a decision. The conference table surface held a scatter of reflections. My pen, the corner of the brown envelope, the red edge of the stamp pad. I could smell the coffee cooling in its urn by the credenza, that end-of-day smell, even though it was still morning. A bitter syrup that promised the afternoon would be longer than anyone wanted. The senior paralegal and the receptionist stepped through the side door, the envelope balanced between them. I watched it go with the calm I recognized from hospital corridors and courthouse benches, that calm that knows patience is not a feeling, but a muscle. On the projector, the slide did not advance. The blinds clicked softly like teeth. The side door clicked shut from the inside, and my envelope sat just beyond the glass. The glass swallowed my envelope like a quiet tide, and I was left outside it with my blue folder warming under my palm. The clock above reception ticked loud enough to be a metronome. The sign-in sheet gleamed under the clip like a polished plate. A pen scraped, another name sliding onto the list, while mine remained on the line it had been given. My chair was still a few inches from the table. My breath found a square rhythm. 4 counts in, 4 held, 4 out. Steady in the shake I wouldn't give to any paper. The elevator doors parted with a rubbery sigh, and my granddaughter moved toward me. That small burst of sun she carries in her walk. Maya's backpack hit her hip. Her phone was already in her hand, the camera icon blooming like a small lens flower. She pressed her shoulder to mine without asking if she could, and it steadied a piece of me that had started to tilt. The hall smelled of copier toner, and cold air pushed through a vent with a faint metallic whine. She asked what we had, and I gave her the numbers, book, page, date, while the hum of the building stood like a horizon line. Thumbs fast, she pulled up the county clerk's index, and her screen filled with the ugly, beautiful lines of public records. Tap, tap, tap. She found the entry where the letters of my father's name sat, unfancy and indelible. She took 2 screenshots, then another, and saved them with the automatic timestamp that puts the hour on a spine. I opened my notebook. She slid the phone beside it and labeled everything with small arrows, drawn a map across lined paper with the same calm she used to tie her shoelaces when she was little.
We crossed the street to the county building, the cold air coming off the glass like a refrigerated breath. Diesel from a bus worked into the wind and laid a thin layer on the back of my tongue. The security wand chirped around my waist for reasons it didn't explain. Maya moved through her lane without a sound, her sneakers squeaking once on the tile. I emptied my pockets in a bowl that looked cleaner than a church dish, and the guard handed me back a plastic tray of keys and a coin that suddenly mattered to me more than it ever had. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency that made the room feel like a held note. The county clerk's counter had that old courthouse smell, varnish, faded paper, the ghost of a mop. Jordan, the trainee, looked up with the soft alertness of someone who has been taught to listen. We gave him the numbers. He checked the computer and then pulled a ledger from a shelf with the care you give a sleeping child. The book was heavier than it looked. When he opened it, the spine made a sound like a small oath. There it was, the addendum, stamped, the date recent enough to feel like a handprint on my shoulder. We asked for a certified copy.
Jordan took the pages to a branching of machines, a copier that coughed warm paper, a press that left a raised seal, a time stamp that laid numbers with finality. He brought it back with the clear plastic sleeve, the edges cool against my thumb. The seal caught the light and turned it into something you could touch. The receipt printed out with a faint scorched smell at the edges, the ink not yet settled into the fibers. He explained cross-indexing in a patient voice, recorded under property, mirrored in probate, still waiting to be attached to the case's main tree so every branch would see it. It existed. It lived in the right book and spoke the right language, but the threads hadn't been tied where the people upstairs wanted to look. There was a gap between yes and yes that paperwork knows how to keep open. We sat at a little table near the window and gave the copy its place. Maya peeled a binder clip from her backpack and made a clean stack. Certified addendum on top, Annex B behind it, the receipts, the 2 witness statements, my letter of instructions tucked along the right edge with its reference line showing. She slid each into my blue folder, her fingers sure, and for a second I saw her mother's hands. My wife had taught me that order is not a flavor, it is a kind of gravity. The folder settled into my lap heavier and also lighter. Back at the street, wind collected in the avenue like it had nowhere else to go. Pigeons lifted and set down again without deciding anything. We re-entered the building where the morning had started. The lobby lemon cleaner had ripened into something sweeter and more tired. The guard recognized me with the small nod people give to say they remember the rules, not the person. The elevator numbers lit in a courteous march, 8, 9, 10, until we were back on the floor where toner never cooled. When we returned to the conference room, the projector was still frozen on a column that had my name near its feet. I set the certified copy on the table where the reflections gathered. I said, "Please put the book and page into the minutes," giving the receipt number 2, the hour stamped on the bottom edge like the time on a birth certificate. The paper made a faint plastic sigh in its sleeve. The senior paralegal slid the document toward her with her nails held just above it, as if to avoid touching a live wire. The executor's face didn't move. The room's speed changed. Air conditioning lifted a corner of a notepad. The paralegal tapped keys, not looking up, the sound like rain on a thin roof. The receptionist wrote something on a form and then crossed it out, the line making a soft fabric sound. The projector's fan spun. A murmur collected by the glass and had nowhere to go. The agenda's table of contents, neat as a new haircut, didn't know there was a page it hadn't expected to meet today. The executor asked for technical time in a voice that worked like a lid. We would pause to reconcile internal systems, to integrate inputs, to validate provenance. The words were smooth and important. The senior paralegal nodded, as if agreeing with a mirror. "This material isn't on today's agenda," she said softly, which is the kind of sentence that lets a door close without sounding like it's shut. Maya slid her shoulder against mine again, the small, warm counterweight to the cold mechanics of the room. On the screen, numbers waited. The equalization clause the addendum promised did not show up in any column. There was no line for what I had done for years, no place for the receipts that still smelled faintly of old cash drawers and a nurse's office. The spreadsheet held no empty cells where a person could put care. It had formulas, not gravity. I could hear my heartbeat counting off the projector's fan. The coffee on the credenza had turned the color of late afternoon. A chime popped quietly on the paralegal's laptop, one of those polite sounds that carry their own authority. She leaned in. The executor's phone lit his face pale. The receptionist stepped into the hall and back, her clipboard flipping to a new sheet with the papery sound of a wing. Maya looked up at me and then at the certified copy, her mouth a straight line that contained things it could have said.
They told me what the email said, without lifting their eyes from the screens. The addendum was valid, but nothing in the distribution schedule changed until it was attached to the probate case file. The words stacked themselves neatly, like they had been waiting backstage all morning. The schedule in progress would continue as if the table we stood at were not holding a paper with a seal that still cooled to the touch. Jordan's receipt number meant something across the street. In this room, it was a raindrop on a diagram of weather. I watched the ceiling vents exhale in cycles and felt the old ache that accompanies long corridors and benches that let your back forget it is part of you. I thought of my wife's insistence on labeling every envelope and of the way our kitchen smelled in winter when the oven was on too long. I thought of my granddaughter's steady fingers making order where rooms prefer fog. The paralegal screamed through a rectangle of light that touched the edge of my certified copy and then pulled back. The email landed, and it said, "Until the addendum lives inside the probate file, nothing moves." The email drew a clean box around me and told me to wait inside it. I stood up from the table with my blue folder pressed under my arm, the laminate catching on the fabric of my jacket. The paralegal screen kept its rectangle of light. The projector sighed. The message had given the rule in tidy words, and the rule was this: until the paper lived in the right file, nothing in the room recognized it as alive. In the corridor, the air was cooler, touched by the whisper of a vent and a faint chemical of carpet glue that never fully goes away. I leaned the folder against my thigh and let my hand rest on it the way you rest a palm against a door you've already decided to open. Years lived in that plastic. Doctor visits logged in ink, medication receipts, short notes I wrote so I could read back the days that tried to blur. My wife had liked blue because it stayed patient in the eye. She told me once that if you put a thing in order, the thing remembers you. She wasn't wrong. I breathed in 4 counts, held 4, let out 4, and watched as a receptionist rolled a cart of water pitchers past me without meeting my eye. A partner stepped close enough to share his cologne, but not his glance. I felt the familiar layup of small dismissals, the second ID, the chair nudged to the end of the table, the email that called a living paper a ghost because it hadn't learned the correct hallway. None of it had teeth, but together it bit.
Maya came to my side so quietly, I only knew she was there because the temperature shifted. "We have what we need," I said, and felt the sentence steady as both. She nodded, phone already in her hand. The blue light of the screen reflected in the plastic sheen of my folder. We took the stairs. The stairwell smelled like rubber treads and old concrete. My knees had their own opinions, but they obeyed. On the street, a bus exhaled brake dust into our faces. The light changed, the crosswalk chirped, and we moved in the slice of the city that belonged to the walking. The courthouse block held its winter shade even when the sun was out. It always has. A pretzel cart steamed on the corner, sweet salt drifting under the largest scent of diesel and a midday chill. Security wanded my belt buckle again and asked me to place my keys in the tray again and smiled at me like a rule being polite. Maya passed, and her sneaker squeaked once. Inside, the lobby was all blue-gray and fluorescent, the long tone of public buildings that were designed to last longer than the people who build them. Jordan recognized us with a small nod, the kind that says he remembers our names, even if policy would prefer he remember only numbers. We gave him the plan. We needed to file a notice to put the certified copy inside the probate case where people upstairs would have to see it. He was careful with his words, always careful, but he nodded again, and his hands moved to the right keyboard.
We found a table under a faded poster about open records and cleaned the surface with the edge of my sleeve. I opened the blue folder, and the hinge of the plastic made a friendly click. The certified copy lay on top, seal raised like the surface of a coin. I slid my notebook beside it. The paper smelled faintly of pencil shavings from years ago. Maya sat close enough that our shoulders spoke without mouths. We drafted the notice in plain language that learned its politeness from the same schools as the email that had boxed me in upstairs. Case caption, my name in the same line as my brother's, reference to book and page, list of attachments by simple count, a request sentence that did not kneel and did not shout. Maya typed it on her phone first, thumbs confident, and then we copied it by hand into the form the clerk provided. My letters were slower than hers, but they stood up straight. I could feel my wife's gaze approving the spacing. Jordan read the draft and circled 2 fields. They'll kick it back without these, he said in a voice that stayed neutral but carried the shape of kindness. He pointed to a box for supporting exhibits and another for time of recording. Maya filled them in, reading each number for me in a low voice like a string of beads. We needed one more set of eyes before the stamp. Back through the revolving door of the private building, past the guard who watched me choose the same plastic bowl for my keys again, to the 12th floor where the air tasted like hot toner once more. I asked for Luis, the junior paralegal who had the sort of tired eyes that notice when the scale leans for reasons that aren't listed in the manual. He met us in the hall, away from glass and microphones, a legal pad tucked under his arm like a secret he would not let go of. He didn't touch the paper, not in a way the cameras would care about. He leaned near enough to see and named the minimum so the county would not send us back. Attached the receipts as Exhibit A, witness declarations as Exhibit B, certified addendum as Exhibit C, cross-reference Annex B by title. Write the receipt number from the clerk at the bottom right in blue ink. He said blue as if it had just become his favorite color. He looked tired and honest. He nodded once, and I nodded back, and we left with gratitude we did not write down. The scanner room in the county building had a machine that ran warm as a dog in a patch of sun. I fed each page, the rhythm steady. Were, light, return. Were, light, return. The screen showed each image with a small preview that made even serious papers look like toys. Mayor checked the corners for shadows and tapped to accept. A clerk behind glass slid me a plastic tray for the originals and a ticket with a number that hummed with quiet dignity. At the counter, we waited behind a man paying a fee in torn bills he had smoothed on his thigh. A woman with a stroller laughed once and then stopped, remembering where she was. The wall clock had a second hand that paused at the top of each minute and then jumped as if it had been reminded of something. When our number showed, the clerk with the ribbon in her hair took our packet without looking at us and stamped the top page with a sound like a shoe hitting a mat. She affixed a tiny decal with a barcode and fed the hole into a slit that led to a place I imagined as a bright canyon of paper. She typed and then said the words that start a new paragraph in a person. "You're recorded," she said. She slid a receipt that still smelled of warm plastic and laid the time where we could see it. The digits landed true. We stayed there for one extra breath because sometimes I have to feel the air move around the thing before I believe it exists. With the receipt in my blue folder, I felt the city tilt a fraction in the direction of yes. The building across the plaza housed probate. We walked to it in that thick afternoon light that always looks the same in government squares. Inside, there were benches nailed to the floor. A bulletin board announced a status calendar that was already full, the names printed so tight it looked like the ink had no room to breathe. Maya took a photo and zoomed. The hours were gone, but sometimes one slides loose, she said, and said it like she had seen it happen. We approached the window. The clerk there had eyes that could flatten a problem or inflate it, depending on the weather of the rules. I slid the receipt and the notice through the opening and asked, in the tone I use when I want the person to hear the street in my voice and not the years,
where the newly recorded documents might be enough to request a spot on today's status docket. The clerk took the pages and read. The minute hand on the wall made its slow climb. The hum of the building changed in a way you can only hear when you're paying attention. She asked for a moment and disappeared without paper. When she returned, she hadn't decided to smile, but something in her face had put down its bag. "If there's a vacancy," she said, "it will post on this board." She gestured with a capped pen, and I could see the faint blue line of ink that had dried on the plastic. We sat on the bench beneath the board and waited like people waiting on test results, on weather, on a bus. Time stretched itself carefully. A janitor's cart went by and left a clean stripe that smelled like pine. Two lawyers argued quietly in the corner, their hands making shapes that didn't match their mouths. A child dropped a toy car and it skidded under a seat to a place only a corn could see. Maya leaned her head on my shoulder once and then sat up straight again, as if her spine were talking to the clock. Ava arrived in a gust of outside air, a press badge swinging against her sweater. She was smaller than I had imagined from her byline, and she had the contained energy of people who take notes for a living. She introduced herself, returned the papers I had given her last month at a community meeting about public notice boards, and asked only one question: whether I minded her observing. I told her the truth. People behave better when they think someone will read what they do. She nodded and stood near the board, pen ready like a compass.
Late afternoon folded its shadow over the tile. The janitor came back and wiped the same stripe again. A light inside the clerk's office switched off and then on, a quick false night and day. My breath found its old square. Maya checked her screenshots again and lined them up on her phone in the order we had lived them. The board did nothing, and then a thin sheet slid under a clip with a satisfied click. A vacancy had opened where there had been none, a line break in a page that had looked sealed. The clerk called our case. The hallway deepened by a hush no one had asked for, and the red light above the hearing room blinked on as the doors swung open. If this is reaching you, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and send it to a friend who cares. The doors swung open and the room breathed cool air into the hallway. Inside, the hearing space was smaller than I had imagined. No grand wood paneling, just pale walls, a state seal on a plaque, a clock that clicked softly, and tables that had been wiped down so often the laminate had gone dull at the corners. A red light over the doorway steadied. The carpet held the faint, clean smell of last night's vacuuming. I felt the weight of my blue folder change in my hand, not heavier, just more exact. We took seats at a side table marked for filings. The executor and his attorney took the opposite table, whispering in the way people whisper when they want the room to know they are whispering. Maya sat close enough that her shoulder warmed the sleeve of my jacket. Her phone screen stayed dark now, face down, a promise to pay attention with eyes instead of glass. I placed each document on the felted surface one by one. Certified addendum with the raised seal, Annex B with the conditions printed in patient sentences, the receipts in order by month, the 2 witness statements, and the notice we had filed with its fresh barcode. I put them down as it land tools on a bench for someone who knows how to use them. The clerk reached for the stack and made the small sound people make when they approve of order. She slid the top page under a clear ruler and aligned the corners until they behaved. She worked by names, exhibit labels first, simple letters that would anchor the paper to the record, A, B, C. The stickers came off the reel with a sigh of adhesive and landed in the top right of each page with a press of her thumb. A felt-tip marker squeaked once as she wrote the case number on the tabs in a hand that had done this thousands of times. The sound was ordinary and sacred, She turned to her keyboard and entered the book and page numbers, tapping the keys with the pace of someone who trusts muscle memory. The hearing officer, no robe, just a suit that had seen many Tuesdays, read the caption out loud and confirmed the narrow scope of a status docket: to register, to recognize, to route. This was not a place for speeches. It was a room for the act of putting a thing in its proper folder in the right drawer so the drawer could open when it must. My name and my brother's sat side by side on the caption line, like two houses on a map. On a spare chair behind us, Ava opened a reporter's notebook and dated the top corner. She made herself smaller than the furniture demanded, as if to say the story would live in the facts and not in her posture. When she looked up from the page, her expression carried that careful neutrality that I have come to trust more than a grin.
Before the clerk began marking, the receptionist from the law office appeared at the back of the room, eyes down, a paper in her hand. She caught my attention without asking for it and nodded once, a precise and guilty nod. I read the top line, a written acknowledgment of the check-in era that had placed my name in the smaller font and shifted the chair at the long table. It included a sentence about updated front desk practice for readings and a line promising retraining. It was not an apology, and it did not need to be. It was a correction, signed and dated, the ink not yet dry at the loops. I slid it into the inside pocket of my folder where I kept small certainties. My phone vibrated once, a gentle knock from the pocket. A short email from the building security office had arrived, copied to the property manager. A note acknowledging that 2 random screenings of the same visitor in close succession could introduce bias in throughput. A commitment to revise the rotation schedule and reinforce guidance. It was the language of policy, spare and almost shy, but it said what a person could not force another person to say out loud in a lobby. I breathed and let the note sit without triumph. These were small doors closing that should never have been open. The officer nodded at the clerk. One by one, the clerk picked up our exhibits and called them by their new names for the microphone that watched the proceeding. Exhibit A, Certified Addendum. Exhibit B, Annex B, Conditions. Exhibit C, Receipts. Exhibit D, Witness Statements. Exhibit E, Notice of Filing with Barcode. She set each into a stack that would move into the file and become part of the spine there. She did not rush, and she did not drag time. Her hands had the authority of repetition. The executor's attorney raised 2 questions that were not objections, just pebbles to be set on a shelf. Confirmation of the recording time on the certified copy and whether the witness statements included full addresses. The clerk verified both with a calm that carried no temperature. The time matched the receipt, the addresses were complete. The officer looked at the parties and described the next mechanical step as if he were reading the ingredients on a label. The addendum would be recognized for the file. The equalization clause would be regarded as active subject to the exhibits. The executor would recompute the figures under supervision of the clerk's office and provide the revised schedule for the record. No one in the room changed color. The words were ordinary, and they touched the future only as far as the page in front of us. A map had been drawn. We could see where the line would go when the pen moved. I let my fingers rest on the blue folder and felt the little nicks in the plastic where life had scraped it over years. Grocery counters, waiting room benches, a church pew where sunlight found dust in winter. The officer asked whether any additional materials would be offered for today's status. I shook my head. I could have offered memories, but rooms like this did not take those. Maya leaned toward me and whispered the time from the receipt so I would have it in my mouth if I needed to say it again.
Her voice contained the softness of family and the sharpness of a student who knows the answer and also why it matters. The clerk moved on to the mechanics of recomputation. She opened a thin laptop that looked older than the one in the law office and connected it to a small printer with a cable that had been taped in 2 places. The printer warmed with a familiar hum and released 3 blank cover sheets like exhalations. The executor stepped to a side table with his paralegal and opened a spreadsheet that mirrored the one we had seen upstairs. This time, there was a place for what had not had a place. The columns waited with a courtesy they had not shown in the conference room. Ava made a note about the labeling process, the timestamps, and the office's instructions. She drew a small square in the corner of her page and shaded it in, a habit maybe from school days when a teacher talked too long. She caught my eye and gave me a nod that felt like a hand on the back between shoulder blades.
The side matters that had scratched at the morning let themselves resolve in the quiet. The front desk's acknowledgement on paper, the building's nod toward its own blind spots, the room's acceptance of the exhibits without drama. None of it undid the wheel of the larger thing, but it removed gravel from the spokes. The hum of the small printer settled into a steady, practical rhythm that felt like breath returning. The clerk stamped each cover sheet with the kind of date stamp that still uses ink. The sound was a damp kiss. She slid them into plastic sleeves. She put the exhibits behind them in the order she had named them, and for a second I could see the future spine of the case as if it were a back on a shelf I would never touch again. One of the lights overhead flickered and then held. Paper whispered as it learned its new place. The officer summarized for the microphone. Exhibits admitted for the file. Recomputation to proceed under clerk supervision. Revised figures to be produced for the record. He did not say when a final would be entered. He did not need to. This was a room for lining up dominoes, not for pushing the first one. My heart found its square counts again. 4 in, 4 hold, 4 out. The air in the room had that faint metallic taste of copied toner and cooled coffee. Maya slid our receipt back into the front sleeve of my folder and pressed along the seam to make sure the edge did not lift. I remembered my wife's habit of smoothing wrapping paper with the flat of her hand so the tape would have less work to do. There is a gentleness in preparing a surface for adhesion. It says you expect things to hold. The officer checked his watch and then the clock on the wall, a small discrepancy that belonged to the clocks and not to us. He asked the clerk to note that the recomputation would occur under the current session's umbrella, with any remaining arithmetic to be finished under the same case caption. The clerk wrote in a tidy hand on a form I could not read from where I sat. The pen made a sound like a small zipper. No one raised their voice. No one argued. It was not victory and it was not defeat. It was the clean edge of a tool in the right hand. The room had done what a room can do when it remembers its purpose. The officer thanked the parties for their cooperation in keeping the matter within the bounds of the docket. The red light over the doorway did not change. We gathered our things slowly, as if quick movement might smudge fresh ink. Ava capped her pen and slid the notebook into her bag. Maya lifted her chin the way she does when she wants me to see that her spine is strong. The executor and his paralegal bent over their screen in the way people bend when they have to change a number and make sure the number stays changed. I closed the flap of my blue folder and felt the quiet of a door that fits its frame. We stepped back from the table and the room held steady, ready for the next small, exact act. We stepped back from the table and the room held steady, ready for the next small, exact act. The hearing officer conferred with the clerk in a voice pitched to carry only as far as it needed. The printer near the rail warmed again. A thin fog of warmed plastic rose and disappeared. The executor and his paralegal took their seats, shoulders angled in toward a laptop that mirrored the columns we had watched upstairs. This time there was a column that hadn't existed before. It waited for numbers that had not been given a place to land.
The clerk called us forward by case caption. We returned to the tables. My blue folder fit flat under my palms. I could feel the ridges and scars in the plastic, a topography of other rooms. Maya sat so close our elbows almost touched. The officer summarized for the microphone. Exhibits A through E marked. Certified addendum recognized. Annex B received. Receipts and witness statements present. Recomputation to be conducted on the record.
The executor cleared his throat. His fingers hovered over the trackpad and then settled. Cells blinked awake. He read, not with ceremony, but with the caution of someone crossing ice. Evaluation, then another. A line item moved from one column to another. The equalization clause was applied to the figures with the time printed on our receipt as its anchor. He narrated the arithmetic plainly, the way a person counts inventory when they want another person to be able to check it behind them. The small printer spit out a recalculation sheet with a faint chug that made me think of a sewing machine. The senior paralegal spoke once to ask for a verification of the recording time. The clerk read it from the receipt with the evenness of a metronome. The attorney asked whether the witness statements met the address requirement. The clerk confirmed they did. There were no objections, and there were no speeches. The officer asked that the revised schedule be printed and labeled for the file, and that the executor sign his name beneath the line that said he had recomputed under clerk's supervision. The pen the officer handed across had a soft grip, worn smooth by other hands. The signature landed clean. Ava wrote in her notebook with her knees turned slightly toward the aisle, as if that position made her pen more honest. She had noted the exhibit labels before. Now she wrote down the time and the name of the form. She did not write adjectives. The receptionist from the law office lingered near the back, then approached the clerk's table during a pause and handed over a memo. The clerk glanced at it, spoke softly to the officer, and tucked it into the administrative stack. I recognized the heading, Front Desk Procedures for Conference Sessions. It contained a sentence about seat placement during readings and a directive to standardize name displays on sign-in documents. It had the feel of a door being fixed on its hinges. The officer asked the clerk to mark the memo as a communication received and to note that it pertained to general practice, not to the merits of the case. The clerk's pen ticked once against the paper. The building security office sent a short statement that reached the officer through the clerk's screen. An acknowledgement of policy drift during morning cues, and an instruction adjusting the rotation to avoid double random checks. The officer directed it to be placed in the administrative file for the hearing, not because it belonged to the estate, but because it touched the fairness of the room itself. It took less than a minute and felt like air returned to both lungs. The officer turned to the record and read the essential words that changed the flavor of a day. The addendum recorded at the county clerk's office was recognized as part of the case file. Annex B's conditions had been satisfied by the exhibits received. The equalization clause was now active as applied in the recomputation. The revised schedule would replace the prior draft under the same caption. He spoke like a person describing a road that had always been there once the fog pulled back. The seal of the court on the wall above him held the light without wincing. The consequences began to declare themselves in the way paper declares. The executor signed the recomputed schedule and handed it to the clerk, who stamped the corner with the damp kiss of ink. The senior paralegal, her voice steady, acknowledged on the record that the office would circulate an internal notice to ensure that recorded materials submitted by any party would be checked against public indexes before readings. The officer asked her to send a courtesy copy to the clerk's administrative inbox. She nodded, not as apology, but as a person accepting instructions that made the road cleaner for the next car.
A brief conversation followed about cross-indexing, technical and dry, and it ended with the clerk's promise to request a patch from the records team so recordings mirrored across property and probate would generate a flag on both screens. She said the word flag as if it were a tiny lighthouse. The officer asked that the existence of that request be noted in the minutes so a reader months from now would not think the improvement had appeared without anyone asking. The hearing room sounds grew more domestic as the hour went on, paper sliding, chairs adjusting by inches, a cough, a whispered request for a stapler that worked better than the one with the missing chrome. My breath kept its square counts, 4 in, 4 hold, 4 out. I heard my wife laugh in a memory of a kitchen where we once argued about whether recipes were rules or suggestions, and learned we were both right if we kept the flame low. The officer asked me if I wished to add anything for the record on the narrow question of exhibits and procedure. I said only this, that I appreciated the recognition of the recorded document and the care with which the clerk had aligned the pieces. I did not try to retell a life to a room built to hold only facts. Maya rested a hand on my forearm for the length of one slow count and then let go. The officer concluded the status. He summarized the steps taken and the steps ordered. Exhibits admitted, recomputation completed and signed, revised schedule to be entered, administrative notices to be circulated, cross-index flag request noted. He thanked the parties for maintaining decorum. He did not congratulate anyone. He did not scold. He drew a neat box around what had been done and left the future outside the margins, knowing it would arrive when it was supposed to. We rose. The red light over the doorway went dark. The clerk handed me a courtesy copy of the revised cover page with the new date, the stamp a little uneven where the ink pad had grown tired. The paper felt warm from the printer and then cooled as we crossed the room. Ava clicked her pen closed and gave me a nod that said she would do her job and that her job would be to say exactly what happened. The executor and his paralegal carried their laptop and forms to the hall with the posture of people who would not be staying for coffee. At the rail, the receptionist with the corrected memo looked at me and did something that felt human. She held the door long enough for Maya and me to pass together, the blue folder against my ribs a familiar pressure. Out in the hall, the building's air tasted of dust and the metal of elevators. The clock by the water fountain said late afternoon. A janitor pushed a cart past, and the streak of pine followed like a clean, thin line. Maya asked if she should photograph the revised cover page for our records. I told her yes, and watched her line up the corners within the square on her screen. The shutter sound on her phone was a polite click, as if the device understood something about rooms and proof. She slid the phone into a pocket and leaned into me the weight of a small promise kept. My chest felt less armored and more occupied, as if a chair had been pulled in for me at a table where my name was the same size as the others. In the lobby, the security guard looked up and gave a nod he had not offered this morning. It was small. It was enough. Outside, the cold air felt clean. I held my blue folder close and thought of the quiet way stamps land, and how once they land in the right place, the page stops arguing with itself and becomes part of a book you can actually read. Justice is not a gift. It is a stamp landing where it belongs. When fairness is written into the record, it stops being a kindness and becomes the rule. If you like this story, tap like, subscribe, and write what you'd do if it were your family. I'll be here for the next one.